I want to come back to border adjustment tax. Have you taken a position? Do you have a view about the border adjustment tax?
Yes, my view is that I'm studying it very carefully as it evolves. And as we get to understand more the intricate details of it and how it interacts with everything else, that's when we'll take a position.
And you suggested, as I understand it quite correctly, that Speaker Ryan has put this forward as a way, in principal part, of saving a lot of money for tax reform, basically. But it does have trade ramifications. It will affect trade flows that you must be analyzing.
Oh, absolutely. Anything that affects what goes across the border clearly has a trade implication. But it is meant to be part of an overall tax package. And so you have several issues. One is the question whether or not to do a border adjustable. Second is what magnitude of it is needed. And then third are the intricate details. How does it really work? If you're a solely domestic producer who does some exporting, that's one set of facts. If you're mainly an importer, a different one. If you're both, even more complicated. So it isn't a very simple thing to analyze. And because it's so important in such large numbers, as you know, they're talking about potentially $1 trillion over a 10-year period. That's way too big a number to get wrong.
I want to turn now briefly to Germany because Chancellor Merkel will be visiting Washington next week.
Yes.
There's been some discussion, not from you that I'm aware of, but some discussion from the administration about trade with Germany, where there is, again, a trade deficit. Will that be on the agenda for discussions with Angela Merkel?
My guess is that those discussions will be somewhat higher level than getting precisely into how many automobiles from Germany get sold here. I'd be very surprised if you got to that level of granularity in the discussions. It's also complicated in that Germany is not a separate entity. Trade relations with the outside world fundamentally come through the EU, so it's a little more complicated structurally dealing anything with Germany than with, say, Mexico or Canada.
And this is a point that Peter Navarro, who has a role on trade at the White House, made when recently he actually criticized Germany, saying they were getting an advantage in trade because they're part of the euro, which is artificially low, where if it were a Deutschmark again, it would be high. Is that part of trade policy for the U.S. government?
Well, currency is a factor in trade, clearly. And for example, with Mexico, the weakness of the peso has been a significant factor in trade. Peso is way down versus the dollar just this year, let alone prior years. So sure, that affects the relative competitiveness of countries.
But is it U.S. policy at this point that the euro is too weak against the dollar?
The currency matters are mostly dealt with by Treasury, not by commerce. And my plate's pretty full with what is on it. So I'm not going to go poaching food from other people's plate.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, does it strike you as ironic? You mentioned the peso being down this year. If you tracked how candidate Trump did in the polls, it had a direct relationship with the peso. A lot of the peso devaluation appears to be in response to President Trump getting elected. Is it ironic that the more successful he is, the more it drives down the peso and exacerbates the problem of the trade deficit?
Well, that's a complicated equation. I think what it does show is that markets tend to adjust to realities. And as the probability of the Trump presidency grew, clearly it had some implications for Mexico and others. And now that the Trump presidency is a reality, it has even more clear implications.